Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
Plato's theory of knowledge. What did Plato believe about knowledge? First of all, he believed that there's a difference between knowledge and sense perception. What is sense perception? Anything that comes to us through our senses. So anything that we see or hear or taste or touch or smell, all those are sense perceptions. There's a difference between what comes to us from the senses and what we know. So Socrates refused to believe that truth is relative, right? There were some people who believed that the truth depends. What's true for one person may not be true for another person. Wait a minute, Socrates is going to try to find out what are these general and universals. So there's got to be this universal notion of truth, of things that are true for everyone, in every place, and of all times. There have to be things a truth that is true for all. Ethical conduct must be founded on knowledge. Again, that goes back to Socrates' idea, right? If we know what's right, what are we going to do? We'll do what's right. Knowledge must be a knowledge of eternal values, not subject to senses or subjective opinion. So if we're going to have knowledge, it's got to be about things that endure. Knowledge of things like the ideas and the forms, the good, of beauty, of justice. Our knowledge is about these things and less about those things that change. So the particulars that come to us through our senses, why study those? Because those change. Or things that are subject to personal opinion. Well, I think one thing. Well, I think another thing. You know, everyone has their opinion on any subject, right? So Plato's challenge was, how do we rise above all those opinions rather than I think this, you think that? Wait a minute. How do we come to some higher level? So it's not just everyone having their own perspective. We talked about that before, right? How it is that we're looking at the same book. Becky and Deacon Roy tell me that it says a history of philosophy, and Angelita tends to agree. But Janie and I, from our perspective, we're not seeing what they're seeing. Janie, are you seeing a purple and green book? Janie's seeing a lot of white pages, right? And I'm seeing the back cover of something. I'm definitely not seeing what Deacon Roy and Becky are seeing. How interesting, we all see the same thing from different perspectives. For Socrates, though, let's overcome everyone having their own perspective and see what it is that we can come to about the reality of that book. Follow me? So it's not just everyone seeing it from their perspective. Let's take all those perspectives together and see what objective truth we can come to about this book. Jamie's saying, it's about white pages, it's about white pages. Okay, let's listen to Janie. Maybe Janie's on to something. You know, how do we take all these different perspectives on a subject and come to some deeper, fuller reality of what it is that we're looking at? Values must be the same for all people of all ages, so it's not relativistic values. Values that are relative, that vary, that change based on different people or different societies, different cultures. No. There have got to be these things that are good for all people, that is justice in all cultures. Theaetetus, Plato refutes Protagoras' theory that knowledge is perception and that truth depends on the individual. So Protagoras, a name that we had from last class, was a gentleman who said that truth depends on the person. What's true for one person may not be true for another. It was very relativistic. Is Socrates going to be a relativist saying that the truth depends? No. There is a truth. We just have to discover it. There's got to be a truth that is true for all. Knowledge must be infallible, and knowledge must be of what is. Let's take those apart. Knowledge must be infallible, meaning knowledge can't be wrong. Once we come to this knowledge, for instance, of universals and of generals, then that can't be wrong. That knowledge that we have has to be something we can trust, something we can have confidence in. And it has to be knowledge of what is, meaning it's knowledge of reality. It must be knowledge of something. Is sense perception infallible? Our senses, they can deceive us, right? The example that we used last time was of the mirage. Have you ever had things like that? You're like looking at the pavement on a hot day, and it looks like there's water or something on the pavement up ahead. Is there water on the pavement up ahead? No. Your senses deceive you. So senses are not infallible. Neither is sense perception necessarily about things that really are. right? We can hear different things and our imagination tells us different things, right? La Llorona. I heard La Llorona. Okay? Is that your perception of what you heard? Or is it really La Llorona? Follow me? If perception is knowledge, then no person is wiser than another. Think about that for a moment. If you go with Protagoras' theory of knowledge, that the truth depends on the person, right? Deacon John says the truth is one thing. Janie says the truth is another thing. Okay? If it's relativistic, we go according to Protagoras' view, then neither one is wiser than the other. They both have their own truth. So the question became this. Socrates, or Plato would say, wait a minute, if everyone is as wise as someone else, then how can you charge to give classes, Protagoras? How can you charge the handsome fees that you are if you're no wiser than the other person? If seeing is knowing, because again, the argument that they were making was that the senses are the same as knowing something. So if I see something, then I know that thing. Okay? But if seeing is knowing, then you can't know things of the past. Why? Because you can no longer see them. My mother. I have an image of my mother in my head. Am I looking at my mother right now? No. But if seeing is knowing, okay, I'm currently not seeing my mother, so then I don't know my mother? So, according to that line of thinking, Plato said, if you can't know things of the past, you can't know things of the past because you no longer see them. You have to see things in order to know things. That was the argument. No, Plato's saying that cannot be right. Sense perception, said Plato, cannot be knowledge. The two things cannot be the same. The modern day example we might use is of train tracks. We see the two train tracks. We know that they are. In order for a train to go on those tracks, they have to remain the same distance apart. But what happens in the distance? Does it look like the same distance apart? Those train tracks seem to come together, right? Do they really come together? No, they're the same distance apart. Our senses deceive us. Also, knowledge is not true judgment. Judgment. The example, and this reveals how long ago Father Fred Copleston wrote this book. He used the example, he said, I might make the judgment that President Truman is talking to Mr. Churchill at this moment. Boy, let's use a modern day example then. President Obama could be speaking with Vladimir Putin on the telephone at this very moment. You know what? He could be. And if he is, then I made a right judgment. Follow me? I don't know if he is or not, but if I said it, and if it's true, then I'm right. Even though I'm right, that doesn't mean that I know that. I don't know that President Obama right now is on the phone with Vladimir Putin. It could be right, but I don't know that. So there's a difference between knowledge and being right, making a true judgment. The example that Plato used was that of a courtroom setting. If circumstantial evidence suggests that a person is guilty, but he or she's really innocent. So follow me now. The person's really innocent, but the evidence would lead us to think that that person's guilty. The person's really innocent, though. But the person has a skillful lawyer who plays on the jury's feelings and wins a guilty of not guilty, which is the right verdict. But the jury made a true judgment, but it's not based on knowledge. Follow me there? They made the right judgment. The person was innocent, and they declared the person not guilty. So they made the right judgment. But do they know that that person was not guilty? In fact, the circumstantial evidence suggests that that person was guilty. So they don't know that the person was innocent, but they made the right judgment. So Plato said, we attain knowledge of the stable and abiding through judgments concerning universals. So we're trying to seek these universals, things like good and beauty and justice, and it's in light of those that we attain knowledge of things that are stable and abiding. So the example that Plato uses is the Athenian Constitution. If we say the Athenian Constitution is good, or the U.S. Constitution is good, or anything is good, then the only stable element in that sentence is the concept of goodness. The Athenian Constitution is good, okay? Wait a minute. The Athenian Constitution could change. Follow me? The U.S. Constitution, we could change the laws by which we operate. In fact, that's why good is the only thing that doesn't change in that, because we could change the Athenian Constitution. And those changes could make it bad instead of good. Follow me? But the concept of goodness doesn't change. The concept of goodness is stable, and it's always in reference to a fixed concept of goodness, which is the good. The idea or the form of the good is how we judge the Athenian Constitution. We know the Athenian Constitution is good if it is somehow, we measure that goodness with respect to with a different standard of goodness, which is good with a capital G. So true knowledge then is not knowledge of good things. True knowledge is knowledge of the good with a capital G. We know different good things, right? The Athenian Constitution is good. Becky is a good cook. Angelique is a good judge. How do we use that word good in all these cases? It's in reference to the good with capital G. True knowledge then is knowledge of these things, of the ideas and the forms. That's true knowledge. Knowing these other things, Becky or Angelique or the Athenian Constitution, all those things are pointing us toward these deeper realities, toward the metaphysical, toward the transcendent, right? To this other world. What's the highest kind of knowledge then? The highest kind of knowledge is knowledge of the universals. Not of the particulars, right? The highest kind of knowledge is not knowing the 7 people in this room, but of knowing what all those 7 people have in common despite their differences. That's the highest form of knowledge. So how interesting that we come to know the forms. We can't see these things. We can't see good, beauty, justice. We can't see these things. But we come to them through our senses. We see things that are good and beautiful and just, etc. And from those, we reason that there must be some good with a capital G by which we measure all these good things. We apprehend the ideal, of which particulars are an imperfect realization. The Athenian Constitution, as good as it is, it's imperfect, right? It's not good with a capital G. It's good, but it's not good with a capital G. And so the examples that Plato used were, for instance, the mathematics that we go back to of the circle and of the line that were not perfect, right? Geometers are not interested in imperfect diagrams. They're not so much interested in the diagrams as they are in the idea, right? They're not looking at this and saying, oh, wait a minute, that's imperfect. Look at how you kind of went out of line there. They're not interested in that. They're interested in the idea of a circle. Father Fred says they are really endeavoring to behold those objects which a person can only see with the eye of thought. So we see this imperfect circle here, but really it's referring to this perfect circle, the idea of a perfect circle that we have in our mind. That's what's important about this. It's not how perfect did Father Jamie draw this circle or not, right? It leads us to this idea of a circle, to this form of a circle that exists out there as an idea. Or Plato said the geometrician is concerned with ideal and perfect objects of thought, right? With ideal and perfect circles, ideal and perfect lines, not with the empirical circles or lines or even with geometrical diagrams. It's not about how perfect this line is or isn't here. They're concerned with the idea of a circle, the idea of a line. And so we use hypotheses as starting points, but then we pass beyond them to first principles. We use lines and circles as starting points, but we pass beyond that line and that circle to the idea of a circle and to the idea of a line. Plato's allegory of the cave, have we heard of the allegory of the cave before? So, with the allegory of the cave, it's the story of how it is that we pass through certain conversions, if you will, from less adequate to more adequate cognitive states. How it is that we go from one state into other states. The example that Plato used was, he said, imagine a cave, and we're going to try to draw this here. So here's a cave, here's the entrance to the cave, and you go down into the cave, and of course there's sunlight out here. There's sunlight out here, but the people who are in this cave are on the other side of this wall and have never seen the light. Right? They're so far back in the cave that it's all darkness. In fact, the only thing that they see, because there's a wall right here behind them, and it's a short wall because they're like chained to the floor down here, and so what they see is there's light, there's a fire back here in this section, there's a fire, and so anyone who comes in between the fire and that short wall, what they see is they see the shadow projected up on this wall. So the wall in front of them that they're chained to, they see the shadows that are on the wall. So far so good? Have they ever seen objects out here? Have they ever seen trees or anything? No, the only world that they know is the world of the shadows down here. So Plato says this is where most people on earth live their lives. They just see the shadows. If a person were to escape, what would happen if they lived their whole life in a cave and suddenly went out into the sunlight? Would it be pleasant? No, that person who lived in the cave and suddenly goes out into the sun for the first time is going to feel a little blinded. So the temptation is for that person to run back into the cave thinking that the shadows are more real. Are the shadows more real than the real things outside? No, they're just seeing shadows, but they think that the shadows are more real. But if a person escapes and then grows accustomed to the light and sees the trees and the birds and the river and the mountains, can you imagine how excited that person is going to be? That person who knew only shadows before is now escaped and knows all of these other things. So now this person recognizes that these things are real out here. The mountains are real, and the river is real, and the tree is real, and the squirrel is real. No longer sees things as he did as a prisoner. So now what's going to happen? If he goes back into the cave and tells his friends, oh my God, you'll never believe it. There are these great things out there. Let's call them mountains, rivers, trees, squirrels. It's nothing like anything you see here. Are they going to believe what he says? It's not part of their experience. They're chained to this wall all these years, shadows. They're going to think this guy is out of his mind. Right? How interesting. Because those who love the darkness, this is a great analogy now, those who love the darkness and those who think that the shadows are real are going to end up killing the person who really knew the real. Do you see shadows of Socrates' story in all of this? How it was that this man who saw the light was killed by a bunch of blind people. So for Plato then, education gradually takes us from this shadow world of what we think is real to into the light gradually, because it takes some adjustment, to essentially to apprehend those other realities that other people are not seeing. Education, I like talking about that word. Education comes from a Latin root, ducere. Ducere means to lead. In Latin means toward. In education, what do we lead people toward? In the classical sense, we were leading people toward a knowledge of the forms. But what do we do through education? Why do we send our kids to school? So that we gradually lead them along toward the knowledge of these forms, these ideas, so that once they grasp them, once they see the light themselves, they can help to lead others. That's what education is. The root of the word education, educere, means to lead a person toward knowledge of the forms, so that person can help to lead others toward that knowledge. Education is gradually taking us then from the shadow world of error and falsehood, prejudice and blindness to a knowledge of true values, to eternal and absolute truths and values. Education is especially important for those who rule over us. Do you want someone who's living down here in the world of the blind, in the cave, leading you? And so how interesting that Socrates said education is especially important for rulers. If anyone is going to one day be a ruler in our society, part of the ruling class, and he or she needs education. They can't be living down here in the world of the shadows. Because it's okay, if one person is living down here, that's one thing. But if the ruler lives down here and insists on all of us living down here as a state, he likened it would be like a shipwreck. All of us on this ship, it would be like us. A shipwreck is far worse than the wreck of any individual rowboat. So the ruler must recognize the true good of the state, must see the light, right? And recognize what the true good and true beauty and true justice is. Because if a ruler doesn't recognize that, then we'll have someone leading us who's seeing this shadow world of error and falsehood and prejudice, and who's blind to true values, and who will bring ruin to the rest of us as a result.